Hello and welcome to Conversations with the Voice of Reason. I am your host, Benjamin Boyce, and today's conversant is Dr. Stephen Baskerville, who is a professor at the Collegium Intermedium in Warsaw and research fellow at the Independent Institute and the Howard Center for Family, Religion, and Society. He's the author of several books, some on sexual politics, some on divorce, and most recently, Who Lost America? Why the United States Went, quote, unquote, communist, and what to do about it. In this conversation, we spend a lot of time talking about American divorce law and the fallout from the sexual revolution, and also how that's tied into certain communistic tendencies within the American government and elite. And I learned a whole bunch. You can check out his work linked in the description. And if you enjoy this content, consider liking, subscribing, and yada, yada, yada. Without further ado, here is Dr. Stephen Baskerville.
What this is it's a book on mainstream politics. Up until now, my first book on these topics was very narrowly focused on the injustices of family courts, and the injustices and the destruction of the divorce system and the welfare system, and the what happens to fathers in particular, but also sometimes mothers and children in the family courts. And that was back in 2007. It was called Taken into Custody. And my next book on it was in 10 years later, it was in 2017 called The New Politics of Sex. And that showed the larger parallels of sexual radicalism and the broader question of how radical sexual ideology has affected our politics generally. And it includes the whole panoply of things, although I don't dwell a lot on homosexuality, and transgenderism was not really a big issue even as recently as 2017. But there's a little bit of that, but it's the many, many ways in which radical sexual ideology, or what people call gender ideology, has affected mainstream politics. Well, this third book is on the politics of the last 4.5 years, 4 years or so, since roughly early 2020, shortly before from about the time of the COVID hysteria onward. And it attempts to show how it has affected our mainstream politics. I mean, basically, I argue that there was kind of a coup d'etat in 2020, and the left basically took control of the US government. And so the thesis of the book is, why did this happen? Why were they allowed to do this? And who, above all, who let them do it? Who allowed it to happen? Mm-hmm. Because I argue I argue that the left kind of took power over in the United States, but the corollary to that is that the right, the organized right, the professional right, let them do this. It's almost tautological. And yet nobody acknowledges this. Nobody wants to say, acknowledge that this happened, that the organized right was defeated, humiliated, that they failed miserably.
I don't know. I think people who are on the right, vigorously on the right, let's say, are very disappointed with the conservative movement and have been for quite some time. They, they are given a mile and take an inch and snatch victory from the jaws of defeat, or defeat from the jaws of victory, something like that. And so we know that the actual official conservative right wing is either gelded or playing ball with what we call the right, or the left. Yeah. But could we get into brass tacks before we move to your thesis? I know you have a basis in economics. I wonder if you use that, the skills and the tools that you learned there to make your analysis, your political analysis. And if so, if not, what's that about? And then also, what do you mean by the left? And what do you mean by the right? Like, how do we know what those things are?
That's an interesting question, that second one, which I do talk about in the early pages of the book. First of all, though, I do not have a background in economics. I'm not sure where you got that impression.
I'm sorry, I was looking at your Twitter page. It did say economics. It was a very long write-up in your about page, so I'm sorry if I misread that.
I did get my doctorate in political science from the London School of Economics.
Oh, okay.
whose
That's what.
whose full
Okay.
name is the London School of Economics and Political Science.
Okay.
So that's my training, not economics.
Okay. Poli sci. And how does that way of thinking or that modality inform like the basis of your critiques? Like what
Well,
is the
that's a
bedrock?
good question, because it certainly does. I discovered early on when I started writing about gender politics and sexual politics, and when I started writing about the divorce system, I found that nobody really trained in politics, political science, had ever examined it before.
Hmm.
There was a lot of scholarly literature on the subject from people like psychologists, sociologists, legal scholars, um, and to some extent economists, but all of them were in some ways practitioners. They were almost entirely part of the system. They were practical participants in the system that they were writing about. So their scholarly literature on the subject, even that in the learned journals, was not and is not particularly detached or disinterested. It's very much
Mm.
partisan. And I found that nobody had written about it from the standpoint of political science, or nobody had looked at the political background. And so therefore, everybody kind of shared the assumptions of the system. They shared the legal assumptions on which the system operates and the ethical assumptions. Whereas with my background coming to it from the outside, I was able to look at the politics in the broadest sense, the politics of the judiciary, the politics of radical feminism, the politics of of psychotherapy. It's another one. So the politics of the various practitioners, even those that have scholarly pretensions, but were not terribly, not detached or disinterested by any
Yeah.
means.
They're not terribly self-aware of their motivating factors.
Exactly.
So by what do you mean by politics then? And I'm sorry to get so basic. I just want to really understand how we build up into your critique. Like, so the
Right.
politics of someone, what is that?
Well, it means primarily, first and foremost, I suppose, the government machinery that operates it.
Okay.
For example, the divorce system is a government machinery. It is operated by courts, by social service agencies, by forensic, that is to say, court-appointed psychotherapists. It's all based on a governmental machinery that operates it. So, and yet most of the literature on it deals with kind of touchy-feely stuff about, psychology and feelings and he said, she said, and gender relations, and what women want and what men feel, and
Hmm.
blah blah blah. But my interest was looking hard and fast at what is the government machinery, and secondly, things like the Constitution. How consistent are these? Is this politics of gender, especially divorce, but other things too? How consistent is it with the Bill of Rights, the Constitution of the United States,
Hmm.
the English common law system on which it's all based? And I found quite strikingly, it's not consistent with it at all.
Hmm.
It's I go down the machinery of family law and gender relations, and I find that virtually every article of the Bill of Rights is violated on a daily basis. And I find
Hmm.
that even the civil liberties protections, for example, within the body of the Constitution itself, are violated. And so that's another aspect of the politics that I dwell on quite thoroughly, I think, quite
Yeah.
determinedly. And then there's, of course, the politics of the various actors, even those who are not part of the government machinery. There's the politics of the bar associations, the politics of the psychotherapy industry, the politics of ideology, political ideologies of the feminists, the
Hmm.
political ideology of the conservatives. So these are the kind of things that, to me, turned out to be the most fruitful to look at when I
Hmm.
speak about looking at the political background
Okay.
behind what most people see as a legal or judicial machinery.
Okay. And so what does in that respect with regard to just the divorce system in America, let's say, what is what you look at is happening, actually happening, say about the government machinery? Like how does it describe it in its reality?
Well, that's the basic question, and I find that divorce, of course, is a legal governmental operation. It involves government officials, judges, sometimes
Hmm.
social workers, and other judicial officials, forensic officials, uh, uh, severing people's entering into the private homes, private relationships of private individuals, their own homes, examining their private life, examining their family life, entering into what should be or what we normally think of as the private sphere of life, and injecting the power of their machinery, their state offices, into people's private lives. And the first step in the case of the divorce machinery, of course, is to sever their marriage. Well, actually, that's not usually true, actually.
Hmm.
The first step is usually to remove the father. That is the first principle of the divorce machinery, of the family policy machinery. It's the first thing that is done in a judicial proceeding, especially a divorce proceeding, but even a child abuse proceeding or a domestic violence proceeding. The first step is remove the father.
Okay.
I can get into that in a moment, maybe if you like, about why
Yeah.
that is the case. But basically, the point is, as long as the parents are united, then the state has no rationale for involvement. The state has no justification for its involvement into private life. The
Hmm.
first step that has to be taken is the parents must not be united. They must not have a common front, and therefore and the easiest step, um, pardon me, is to remove the father. Years ago, Margaret Mead, the anthropologist, said that the weakest link in the family chain is the father. Okay,
Hmm.
the mother child dyad
Yeah.
is biological. It's undeniable. It's not something that's open to any question. But the father child link and the father and the husband wife link are much more social constructions, much more socially and legally determined, and they can be severed much more easily. So that's the weakest link in the family chain, is the relationship of father to the family. So the first thing the judges do when there's a divorce filed, or there's a child abuse accusation, or there's a domestic violence, even if it's not brought by the mother, and it doesn't have to be necessarily brought by the mother, the first step is remove the father. Now, they will say that that removal is temporary. The father, it's just a temporary removal, but from that point on, it's done. From that
Hmm.
point on, the burden of proof is on the father to prove why he should be reunited with his children or his family. And of course, he never is fully. From that point on, the state, that relationship is supervised by the court, by the social workers, by the
Hmm.
judges, by the lawyers. And he never fully recovers his parental rights or his family rights. So it's never temporary. It's always permanent, because there's no burden of proof on a judge to show why the father is removed from the family, even temporarily. The burden of proof and the financial burden immediately falls upon the father to prove why he should be restored to his family, why his children should be restored to him, and so forth,
Hmm.
which is
So,
impossible.
well, so if this does violate certain codes and precedences within, let's just say, the American legal system with regard to the
Mhm.
Bill of Rights, the Constitution, civil liberties, all that stuff, people are doing this voluntarily. So they are inviting the government in. So if they're voluntarily allowing the government to encroach upon their lives, is that necessarily, I mean, maybe the government shouldn't do that because it was set up not to do that. But if people are inviting this into their lives, then whose fault is that?
Excellent question. But the fact of the matter is that since the advent of no fault divorce, the government can come in involuntarily and intervene against people who's have not invited the state in. In other words, in a divorce situation, yes, one party usually, I stress usually, not always, but usually in a divorce situation, one party does invite the state in, but the other party, the other spouse, may not have agreed for the state to intervene. That spouse may be legally unimpeachable, may be guilty of no, nor suspected of any legal infraction or transgression, and yet the state can enter into his private or her private life and take control of it without that individual having committed any legal transgression. And this is basically, again, the English common law. This is a basic transgression of one of the most fundamental principles of the English common law, which was that for the state to intervene against you, you're supposed to have at least be suspected of having committed some legal infraction, not necessarily criminal. It could be a tort, a civil infraction, but you have to be suspected of some wrongdoing. But no fault divorce, no fault justice, to broaden the concept, no fault justice, which in my opinion is a contradiction in terms. No fault justice it completely overturns that. It means the state can intervene against legally innocent people. I mean, this is the revolution that was created by no fault justice. It means the courts can legally punish innocent people. Now, they may not call it a punishment. They might call, they take away your children, they throw you out of your home, they seize control of your bank account, but they won't call this a punishment. They won't call it but who wouldn't consider this a punishment? They'll talk about the best interest of the child. They're doing this for the best interest of the child, but they're taking your children away, and they're threatening you with prison if you object. How is this not a punishment? So, no fault justice is a completely revolutionary concept. Even the critics of no fault divorce have failed to understand this. The critics of no fault divorce, no fault justice have focused on the lives that are destroyed, the family life that is destroyed, and the ruined lives that have come out of it. And they're quite right to do so, because that is certainly a huge part of what the legacy of no fault divorce is. But they've completely overlooked this other side of it, which is to allow the state to punish innocent people. And it's nothing less than that. And it may have taken 50 years since 1969 for the logic of this to work itself out.
Yeah.
But that is precisely what is now happening.
Yeah. Thanks for pausing on this. We will get, because I think that this is going to set up our conversation to get into the left and the right and communism and how the conservatives ceded to the left. I think that we're building up to there. But since you brought it up, what you're describing as no fault divorce sounds a lot like a Trojan horse, like a literal Trojan horse. Somebody built this magnificent gift, and in it, whether anybody knew it, even the designers of it, was this infiltrating army, the state, the bureaucracy. So originally, what was it designed to do? How did people buy into it? Why was it appealing in the first place?
Again, excellent question, which has not been explored properly. Well, first of all, it was dishonestly peddled. It was peddled as a divorce by mutual consent. And this was completely deceptive. It was never divorce by mutual consent. It was divorce by unilateral, involuntary divorce. One party divorcing the other, abrogating the marriage contract covenant without the agreement or fault of the other. So that was dishonest. And the question, to answer your question, you have to ask the question, who came up with it? It was not primarily legal practitioners as such. It was feminists. It was radical feminists. And I don't think it was unintended consequences. I think they knew exactly what they were doing. They were drafting these laws back in the 1940s. If you look on the website of the National Association of Women Lawyers, they brag about this. They brag that they came up with the first no-fault divorce laws back in the 1940s. They couldn't get them. They didn't have a prayer in those days of getting them passed. They bided their time until the 1960s, when the cultural climate was much more receptive. Everybody was preoccupied with Vietnam and civil rights, and you had a cultural climate of permissivity,
permissiveness and promiscuity,
and sexual experimentation. Woodstock hippies, screwing in the mud and things like that. And so everybody was receptive to this. And that's when Ronald Reagan signed, ironically, signed the first no-fault divorce bill in California in 1969. He didn't have the foggiest idea what he was signing. He later admitted this. It was deceptive. State legislatures were deceived into thinking it was mutual consent. European governments soon followed suit. They too didn't know what they were passing. But there's no doubt about this. I owe this, by the way, to Judy Perico, an amateur historian, who wrote a book called, I don't remember what it's called, it's a book on no-fault divorce. And she discovered this page, literature from the National Association of Women Lawyers. And they were drafting this, as I say, back in the 40s. And they've been pushing it on the, in recent years, they're still pushing it on the global South, even to this day, which often doesn't have this law.
So originally, what was it designed to do? To give, what was it sold as? To give women freedom, basically? To allow women to get out of situations that are harmful to them, or...
It was allowed, basically. Maggie Gallagher wrote a book in which the best thing about the book, in my opinion, is the title. She called it The Abolition of Marriage. And that's what it was. It was basically the abolition of marriage. It was the abolition of marriage as a legally enforceable contract. From that point on, from no fault on, it was it was a purely voluntary association. There was it's not a legally binding contract anymore. So if you go back to the early feminists in the 60s, when they talked about abolishing marriage, abolishing the family, this is how they did it. This is how they didn't do it by talking women out of marrying, because they couldn't do that. Women wanted to marry. What they did was they basically abolished marriage as a legally enforceable contract. And this allows, yes, women primarily, because women file the overwhelming majority of divorces. It allowed women to break the contract for any reason or no reason at whim. And again, it allowed the state to punish the husband, father, without him having done anything wrong. He could be thrown out of the family. He could be deprived of his children. His bank account could be seized. He could be forced to sell his house. He could, if he didn't pay child support, he could be jailed without trial. And it allowed the state, and things like domestic violence accusations, child abuse accusations, non-payment of child support, all of these things could be punished without trial. There's no trials for these things, by the way. If you ever wonder, you hear you hear these statistics about domestic violence and child abuse, and you assume, well, yeah, they're being punished because these are the statistics. It's a terrible problem. And look at the proof is all these men and being convicted in courtrooms and sentenced to jail. No, there's no trials for these things. There's barely a hearing sometimes. And the man does, in case of child support, the man doesn't even have to be present for the hearing. So, it's a travesty of justice.
I have a follow-up question, but just housekeeping. There's something rubbing against your mic, like a cord, or it's going rip, 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 rip. Just wondering. It might be when you.
The mic is just here. Mic seems to be okay. Okay. I wonder if it's the. Maybe I could pull out this battery.
It's when you move, it goes. I don't know what that is.
If the battery goes dead, then we'll have to plug it back in. But for now,
okay. Okay. So I'm trying to get my head around this. So before no-fault divorce, or after no-fault divorce, at this point in time, we have a tremendous divorce machinery. Seems like that wasn't present before no-fault divorce. Was there a similar and relatively equal marriage machinery to enforce this contract?
No. In fact, I should say that the no-fault revolution in 1969 really codified what was happening already. This trend in the law toward no-fault divorce, toward divorce upon demand, divorce on demand, was actually taking place for decades before. I've found complaints from men back in the 19th century, in the 1890s, complaining that their wives were unilaterally divorcing them and taking the children away and getting custody of the children as a result. So the so-called tender years doctrine, and it started in England, began that, which said basically that if regardless of who divorces and regardless of the reason, the mother should get the children. So it really, no fault kind of codified what was already happening. So it wasn't quite as big a revolution as I am making it out to be, but it did open the floodgates, I think, and it really was a flagrant admission by legal practitioners that they had no regard whatsoever for the basic principles of legal justice and the English common law and the rest.
What would that look like then? That would there be an investigation into the father and the mother? Isn't it the same thing? Like to discover who deserves the children? I mean, the children can't be torn in two. Somebody gets to have the children, right? If the parents split.
Right. Well, increasingly, no, there was never, if there had been, no, there was really never, that issue was never part of the equation. I mean, if you go back far enough into the 19th century, of course, the presumption was father custody. Back in the, John Stuart Mill in his famous treatise on the subjection of women says they are in law his children. In other words, he has presumption of custody. And this was what Mill's wife, Harriet Mill, and others in the mid-19th century onward, Victorian women were fighting to overturn. And they brought in this tender years doctrine, which says that children up to roughly the age of 7 should be with the mother. And then after that, maybe they can go with the father. So it was never about fault. Okay, the idea that the person initiating the divorce, for example, as far as I could tell, that they should not be able to keep the children because they broke a contract which they voluntarily entered into. As far as I can tell, I can't see that ever entered into. It just went from the father, presumed father custody, to a presumption of mother custody, and which was one of the basic first and most powerful, I think, the most powerful planks in the feminist platform. Of which there was basically never any debate that I can tell. And you hear these stories that part of the mythology behind no fault was, there were these ugly battles, and the husband and the wife, in order to get a divorce, they would have to stage an adultery, and they would have to lie about one of them committing adultery. And, they would have to fabricate a tale about how one of them was at fault or both of them were. I'm not sure that's true, actually. I think this is I've never seen any concrete evidence for this. I think this was a rationalization that was brought in order to legitimize no-fault divorce. I think anything more.
I think what you're saying is a clue to not just this topic, but a lot of the political topics, where the law is just codifying what society's already doing. Right? And the law can't necessarily impose morality. The law is an expression of a society's morality, right? And so when we try to fix things, it's really wrong to think that the law can fix this problem. Or if we allow the state to, let's just say, tell us who we can and can't associate with, what we can and cannot say, then we've already lost the game, right? We're already... The civilizational rot is already advanced so far if we're trying to use the law to fix it.
Well, that's true. I think there are basic legal principles, though, that the lawyers and judges should have, and a few did, to be fair, dig in their heels and try to defend. Basically, to make one of the most obvious ones is the contract clause in the Constitution, which is also part of the English common law. No state shall make a law infringing the obligation of contracts. Contracts must be sacred. Even libertarians believe that. Contracts must be enforced by the state. And yet, no-fault divorce is a flagrant violation of the contract.
What do you mean by enforced? I just want to understand.
Contracts must be upheld. They must be, you can't just pretend a contract doesn't exist. If someone signs a contract and they walk away from it, then, they are legally obligated for harm that comes to the other party.
Yeah.
To put it in those
so,
cases.
but that's I just want to understand, what is a justified use of the state's force? And it's to uphold private contracts. right?
Well, I think that's one that I don't think even libertarians,
Okay.
have always, and again, it's in the Constitution. It couldn't be clearer. It's a basic common law principle. Without it, you have complete chaos and nihilism. If
Okay.
contracts are not enforced by the courts, then, you know, you can't have commerce. You can't have a prosperous society. You have
Okay.
chaos. And so, what could be more flagrant than no fault justice as a violation of the contract clause?
Yeah. Well, it doesn't seem like the state's not upholding its end of the deal with regard to contracts. It seems like the state is using that to be more than it should be, to insert itself even more
It is.
into people's lives. And so there's a trade-off here. People are relying on the state, and then the state is taking advantage of people because people are voluntarily inviting the state into their lives in this instance. And I wonder if this if this can be like a way to pivot to what you mean by the left, what you mean by the right, and what you mean by, the totalitarian or communist
Right.
state.
Well, let me just add first that yeah, I mean once the state stopped enforcing the marriage contract, they started enforcing the divorce decree. I mean, there was no kind of middle ground. Once they crossed that Rubicon of not enforcing the marriage contract, then there was, they had carte blanche. They had a free entry into any household in the land to just enter it and start issuing decrees governing the private lives of legally innocent people. Telling people how, if they could be in their home, when they could be with their own children, who controlled their bank account. I mean, things like this. So that was once they crossed that line of not enforcing the marriage contract, then it was a free for all, and that's precisely what we see.
So the state can't not enforce something. So in the absence of marriage, it enforces divorce.
Precisely.
What does that tell us, like on a poli-sci level, what does that tell us about the state or about power or about this bureaucratic mechanism?
It abhors a vacuum.
Okay.
Yes, as the cliche goes. Yeah. I mean, well, also on top of that, once they stopped enforcing the marriage contract, then that basically broke that allowed the courts to enter into the private household, and that became extremely lucrative for the state, for the courts. I mean, lawyers cashed in, psychotherapists cashed in, social workers cashed in, judges cashed in. I mean, once they had entree into the private lives of innocent people, and they could punish innocent people, enter their homes, enter their private lives. They could basically, as a friend of mine put it, they could legislate a personal criminal code around every individual in the family. Once they could do that, then there's no limit to what they can do, and that's when it became extremely lucrative.
Okay. And so that incentive structure has blossomed or metastasized, however you want to go with the metaphors. In your opinion, what is the solution to that or the counter to that? Or,
Well, I talk about this in the conclusion of my new book. I think the marriage contract has to be enforced. Marriage has to be a legally enforceable contract. That's all. I mean, now some people argue that it's also a sacred covenant, under the aegis of the church.
Yeah.
Ironically, a lot of American Christians use that as an excuse not to insist that the legal contract be. In other words, they say, "Oh, it's more than a contract; it's a sacred covenant." Okay, and then they use that as an excuse to look the other way as the state violates the contract and refuses to enforce the contract. So yes, it's more than that if you believe it's a sacred covenant or a sacrament of the church. But at the minimum, whether you're Christian, Muslim, or any indifferent, it must be a legally enforceable contract, or you have chaos.
Well,
let me just add one other thing. That legally enforceable contract must include parental rights, which in practice means paternal rights. In other words, the marriage contract must be enforceable, and that enforcement must include parental rights. If you marry, you have parental rights. If you stay, if you don't commit a legally recognized fault like adultery, desertion, extreme violence, whatever, whatever the local jurisdiction decrees.
Hmm.
As long as you remain faithful to the contract, your parental rights must be honored. So that's part of the deal.
Hmm. Just a segue. I don't know if you want to go there or not, but gay marriage. What's your take on that? And does that is that like damaging the original marriage contract at all? Does it matter?
It does matter. It doesn't matter as much as no-fault divorce does. I mean, the conservatives make a lot more out of it. I think it's a symptom. I don't think it's a cause of family breakdown. I don't think it's a cause of marriage,
Okay.
of the dissolution of marriage. It's a symptom of how extreme it's become, that homosexuals are laying claim to it because it doesn't mean anything.
Hmm.
And this is well, if you look,
Wait, I don't understand. So marriage doesn't mean anything, but divorce does mean something. That's just, it's kind of a weird thing.
yeah, it's a very weird thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's basically what it is. It's. I mean, if you look at the, what would people we call marriage counselors are basically divorce counselors.
Hmm.
That's the
Hmm.
the panacea. That's the solution they have for every problem.
Wow. Yeah.
Because they're, especially when they're in the pay of the courts. If they're in the pay of the courts, then that's
Okay.
that's what
Yeah, they
describe.
facilitate this. Okay. So, I can we switch over to the left right question and
Sure.
communist question? Because I think it there's something really similar about how the state behaves in the domain of marriage and divorce, and how it behaves in other areas of our Commonwealth and our society. I don't know how to tie those two together, but is there a segue that you see?
I don't know if there is or not. I certainly tie them together in my new book
Yeah,
because well, it's ironic that you asked me about this. I shall try not to go on at the mouth about it because
that's why we're here.
before I became involved before I started researching this sexual politics and divorce and radical sexuality, I was a student of ideologies. That was my original field of study, and I
Hmm.
wrote not a history, but I wrote about the early development of left-wing politics. And I argued that leftist politics came out of that political radicalism is an entirely modern phenomenon. There was no left-wing politics in the Middle Ages. There was no left-wing politics in the ancient world among Greeks and the Romans and the Persians and Egyptians, those societies. There's no left-right spectrum. It's entirely a modern phenomenon of post-medieval politics. And the standard explanation is that it began with the French Revolution. I argue that's not true. I argue it began with the first modern revolution, which was in England in the 17th century, and that political radicalism, the political left, grew out of the radical religious left. That religious radicalism preceded political radicalism, and that the first political radicals, the first revolutionaries, were the English Puritans, who overthrew the government of Charles I in the 17th century,
Hmm.
and created the first revolutionary republic. And it's some interesting. Again, this is a topic I love to talk
Oh,
about.
I love it too. I love it
I'm
too.
not sure it's connected with but I just point out that one of the things that this annoys my American conservative friends, because I basically argued that America, what became the United States of America, had its origin in religious radicalism, in a revolution that the Puritans, who people populated North America in the early 17th century, were part of the conflict that they were creating the same kind of theocracy in many ways that their comrades back in Old England were creating using a political revolution.
Hmm.
In fact, I recently read an article about this, drawing parallels with the Iranian Revolution of 1979.
Hmm.
I've long argued that the Americans and the Iranians should have a dialogue about this, because they're not exactly the same. Shiite Islam in the Iranian Revolution was not quite the same thing as Puritanism in the 17th century, but the parallels are quite striking.
Hmm.
Anyway, for the purposes of this book, one of the things I argue about, one of the implications of this argument, is I think that the left, one of the problems with the right, with the conservatives, is they tend to equate the left with communism, Marxism. And I argue that this is not the case. The left has had a long pedigree, long before Marxism appeared on the scene. And there's been various forms of leftist ideology since the Puritans created it in the 17th century. You had the religious radicalism of the Puritans, then you had the Republican radicalism of the French Revolution, and to some extent the American Revolution. You had the nationalism of the 19th century, and you had movements like socialism and anarchism in the mid to late 19th century. And then you had communism in various forms, Marxism came along in the 19th century and with the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, and then the Maoist Revolution in China, of course, was also communist, Marxist inspired. So the point is that leftism, and then I argue that leftism has had these various forms. It isn't monolithic. It hasn't always been the same throughout its history. It certainly hasn't always been Marxist. And my argument today is that the newest form of revolutionary and ideological politics is sexual. In other words, we've gone to a new form that is not Marxist, strictly speaking. It's not cultural Marxist. It is that sexual politics represents an extremely new and extremely significant innovation in the vanguard of leftist politics, and that the right has totally failed to understand it. That the right does not understand sexual politics. Sexual politics has always been there was always some feminism in the French Revolution with Wollstonecraft, and then there was some in the Russian Revolution with Alexander Kollontai and some others. So feminism and sexual politics, sexual radicalism has always played a part in the left from early on, at least in the margins. But since the 1960s, roughly 70s, it has enjoyed its own day in the sun. It has gradually been superseding and displacing in many ways Marxism, socialism, communism, and created a new kind of political radicalism that has defeated the right, that has humiliated the right, because the right doesn't understand it. And the evidence for this is the tenacity with which the right insists over and over again that what we're seeing today in woke ideology is nothing more than what they call cultural Marxism. It's cultural Marxism. This is true to some extent. I don't deny this. It is true. I have a new article coming out on this in Chronicles magazine in a couple of days, by the way. But there is some truth in that. I know the gentleman who coined that phrase, cultural Marxism, is a very brilliant historian named William Lind. And he's right. I mean, there was, the theorists like Antonio Gramsci and George Lukács and the Frankfurt School and some others. Yeah, they did repackage Marxism. They jettisoned the historical materialism. They jettisoned the economic determinism, and they created a more kind of humanistic, moralistic, culturally soothing and form of Marxism that was more palatable especially to the English-speaking world, I think. So there's truth in that. He's right about that, I think. And that, to some extent, is the origins of woke ideology, is in that. And, then you got things like in the 60s, you got racial politics and environmental politics and feminist politics and all the others. My quarrel with that term, though, is that I believe it is being used by conservatives today not to engage with the left, but to run away from a fight, to avoid a fight with the left. They want to fight the battles of yesteryear. They want to refight the Cold War because the Cold War makes them feel good, right? We won the Cold War. We defeated communism in the Soviet Union, and we pretty much defeated it domestically as well. I mean, nobody really pushes orthodox communism, orthodox Marxism anymore in Western domestic politics or in international politics. Even the Chinese Communist Party doesn't care about it, or the Vietnamese Communist Party, the ruling communist parties in those countries. They use the language, but they don't care about Marxism. But the right keeps going on about communism, and that's why in my subtitle of my book, I put, as you pointed out, I put the word communist in quotation marks, in inverted commas, because it's not really communism that we're up against. It's a new kind of politics that is spearheaded, the vanguard of which I believe is sexual. And the right doesn't want to deal with this. They don't know how to deal with this. They're afraid of it. It makes them weak at the knees. It makes them emasculated, frankly, as I show in my new book. And they want to refight the Cold War. They want to demonize Russia and Vladimir Putin and say it's just the Soviet Union all over again. And they want to do the same in domestic politics. So that's my quarrel in this new book, is that the right has dropped the ball. They have run away from a fight that they don't understand because they're afraid of women, to be blunt.
Okay.
They don't know how to deal with they can handle homosexuals, transgenderists. They don't. That's not so difficult. They'll launch polemic and they'll inveigh against that, but they won't inveigh against feminists very much, except on abortion. On abortion, they will a bit, but because they're terrified of the feminists, and especially they're terrified of women generally, especially the women in their own ranks. There's plenty of right-wing feminists. Feminists within the Republican Party, within the right-wing pressure groups, within the churches, especially within the conservative media, and these the right-wing men are terrified of these right-wing feminists, for lack of a better word.
So what is the principle that animates the left that is similar through all these different versions? Like, what is its intention? What's its goal? Or what's its direction whenever it moves?
Good question. Yeah, it's an very interesting question because, what is it that has? I mean, if you look at the modern left today, the feminist left or the Marxist left or the racial left, what do they have in common with the English Puritans of the 17th century? Almost nothing. They would not recognize. In fact, they disowned them. They refused to acknowledge this pedigree, which I say they have. They refuse to look at their own. And you can see it whenever a right winger wants to ridicule the left. What do? They talk about it like it's a religion. Right? They say that the left has dogmas and doctrines and heresy hunters and so forth. And that's true because there's a historical reality behind that. So what is these different forms of leftist politics? And this is one of the reasons why leftist politics, I believe, is so tenacious, it's so survivable, is because it creates new grievances all the time. It creates new, it reinvents itself. If it fails in one respect, it finds another outlet. What is the left? The left is a style of politics above anything else. It's a method of politics that the world had never seen before. It creates radical ideology. Now, what is an ideology? An ideology is a system of belief, a collective. It's more than a philosophy. It's more than a political belief of, like you and I might have our political beliefs. People use it in a very loose sense, but in a strict sense, an ideology is a system of collective belief. You don't hold it by yourself. You have to join with the group, the collective. And it's usually violent. It usually poses, calls for violent overthrow of the existing. It expresses grievances. It expresses discontent. It expresses resentment. It wants change. It demands change. It wants it expresses discontent with the way things are now, and it promises a future that's better. It almost always has a philosophy of history that is linear. In other words, history is not cyclical. It doesn't happen over and over again. It starts at a particular beginning, and it moves in a timeline forward in a so-called progressive way to a final eschaton, an end of which it usually posits to be some kind of a utopia, some kind of a better world.
Yeah.
That's in a nutshell. I teach entire courses on ideology, so I could witter on about it for hours.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's what basically is a collective revolutionary, and it demands political methods. It uses political methods to overthrow, change, or at least reform the state. I mean, I suppose you could have ideologies that are not political, but you don't usually call them
Yeah.
ideologies. For example, I argue that some people say Christianity is an ideology. I would argue Christianity in some forms is
Yeah.
an ideology, like the English Puritans, because that's what they did. They created this philosophy of history. They overthrew the government of Charles I. They created a holy theocracy.
Is this the Whig
Uh,
history that I hear about sometimes?
it's
Progress.
the Whig is a legacy of it. Yes,
Yeah.
the progressive view of history. The Whig is kind of the secularized legacy of the Puritan.
Yeah.
But
Well,
it comes.
so are the woke. The woke are the hyper
Yeah, yeah.
secularized. Yeah.
I think in some ways it is. Some people argue it's all a kind of Christian heresy. It comes out of Christian Gnosticism or quasi-Christian Gnosticism and
Hmm.
heresies, and that is a legacy of. I think there's some truth in that. If you look at the radical sects of the late Middle Ages, the Anabaptists, the Hussites, many of these share this quality before it was secularized in the 18th century, 19th century. So I think then the left introduced this style of politics among the discontented, among the poor, or people that had discontents of other kinds, even among the affluent.
Yeah. Well, the middle
And
class wanting in on where the aristocracy is taking them, and the
exactly,
aristocracy wanting in on where the monarchy is taking them.
exactly, exactly. So it yeah, and it's a style of politics that appeals to intellectuals, to educated
Yeah.
people, to radicals, people who are naturally discontent.
Yeah. Okay.
As Francis Bacon famously said, those if you educate too many people, then you get radical politics because you educate more people than there are jobs to fill.
Yeah.
Uh,
So they have to
in the
make jobs for
universities.
themselves. Yeah.
Exactly, exactly.
Yeah. What is
So
there? Just a brief pause because we're talking about the Enlightenment and what happens. Like, and I'm really squashing history down, so I'm totally open to being corrected or clarified. This, but when the Enlightenment comes, science kind of pronounces itself on the scene, and by that I mean innovation, technological innovation, and it seems like what we're describing here as the left is a technological innovation that happens in the realm of power, of human discourse. It's ideology. It's something that's designed. It's thought of. It's idealistic, and it's kind of mechanistic. It actually, what I see it doing is turning people into cogs in a machine. It really doesn't have any regard for the sacred individuality of anybody because everybody's just a part of this historical movement. I'm wondering if we are susceptible in the modern world to this style of thinking about history as linear, as progressive, because of technology, because there's this other relationship that we have to the material world and to commerce that is also looks very progressive and looks like efficientizes or something. It really relies on making things really efficient in our outer life. And so we've adopted, or there's a confluence between technology and ideology in that we are trying to efficientize politics in the same way that we try to do that with, like making rubber stamps or technology that is really beneficial for us. Does
Oh,
that?
absolutely. Oh no, I absolutely. You're definitely put your finger on it there. Yeah, the modern ideology certainly received a huge boost from, the concept of technological progress.
Yeah.
Nobody really, I think, denies technological
So
and scientific progress.
if I'm kind of right in saying that, then what is the counter to ideology? Is it possible for us to think in two modes of being, like live in a technological world, but believe or practice politics in something that's not ultimately
Right.
susceptible to leftist politic?
Yeah, if that's the trick. It's a very good question again. Yeah, because the modern left, the modern secular left, especially, amalgamates these two. They take the concept of technological scientific progress and they apply it to the political and moral realm,
Yeah.
and they say we can have the same. Now that's taken a lot of hard knocks in the days since totalitarianism, where many of us since Stalinism and Nazism were many, but even after that, this concept of political progress refuses to die. It continues on in the left, and they seem to adhere to it as fervently as ever. Yeah, how do you sever that? Good question. Well, I argue in this book that with the advent of sexual radicalism, we've really, in some ways, I hope, reached the reductio ad absurdum of progressive politics. I mean, in the days of Marxism, of democratic socialism, Marxism, anarchism, I suppose the concept of political and moral progress had some plausibility. But when sexual radicalism is leading us to things like mutilating children's bodies, in the name of transgender ideology, I mean, that's, when we reach this point.
How does that follow? How does the transgender child as a concept follow from leftist ideology, from this eternal grievances, the sexual radicalism? Like, how is that? What does it tell us about what preceded it?
Well, I mean, if you accept my argument that sexual radicalism is the vanguard today of the left, and the vanguard of that, even if it's kind of a fringe element, is the transgenderists, and the transgenderists are advocating or defending the physical mutilation of children's bodies.
Yeah, for what purpose?
For what purpose? Is for an ideological purpose, as far as I can tell. I can't think of anything else. And it's being endorsed by the Biden administration, for example.
Oh yeah.
I would have thought that, somewhere along the lines, people who previously were on the left, like I was at one time, would wake up and realize, this can't go on any longer. I mean, maybe there will be even more absurd, extreme forms.
Well, again, technology is not slowing down, and the transhumanism is wed to technology. It cannot exist without technology. Now we have to reverse engineer the reality, or the supposed reality, of a trans child in order to justify the technological mutilation is one word, or just manipulation of the child's body. But what I'm trying to ask is, what does that say about the ideology that it wants to liberate children from sex? Like, how is that like a flow from Puritanizing? Like, I think there's a thread here, right?
Yeah.
Gnostic heresies, like leftism.
Yeah, I mean, there was always an element of, fanaticism and extremism and hatred in leftist ideology from the very beginning. I mean, if you look at the radical sects of the late Middle Ages, I mean, they were horribly violent. They murdered indiscriminately. They murdered priests and Jews, primarily Jews especially, and non-believers, people outside their sect. I mean, I'm not saying all leftists are bloodthirsty killers by any means.
Yeah.
But that it does have this potential. I would have thought someone would call a halt to it before we reach this point of what we're doing to children. But what does it say about it? I don't know. I would think it'd be self-evident that there's always been an element of irrationality, of hatred. I've argued a number of times that leftist politics originates in resentment, and resentment is an extremely powerful emotion in politics, even when it's justified. And I'm not saying resentment is never justified. Sometimes it is. But the point is, in politics, you can never disentangle it. You can never say when it is justified and when it isn't. And leftism does appeal to a sense of resentment, and it does seem to rationalize sometimes the most bloodthirsty, most bloodthirsty acts. I mean, the Puritan sermons, I admire in some ways the Puritans. I came to develop certain affinity for them, but
they got a rhetorical flair. That's true.
But some of their sermons were pretty horrible, actually. I have to say, only a minority of them, and only toward the end. But they were pretty gruesome at times. Yeah.
So what you said something about conservative feminism, but or the conservatives' inability to grapple or fear, you said, of women. Why is that, and what's the alternative?
Right. Well, I think again, conservatives. First of all, I think sexual ideology is extremely difficult to understand. I've written 3 books on it now, and numerous articles, and I
Hmm.
don't feel like I always have a grasp on it. I discover things every day,
Hmm.
new things that I hadn't thought of before. It takes a lot of, I've spent quite a few years now thinking about it. I think it's much less straightforward than Marxism and social and economic ideology. It obviously, I think it taps into something quite visceral and atavistic in the human soul.
Hmm.
I invoke as an excellent psychologist I invoke in my book, Howard Schwartz, who is a Freudian psychologist, but he does a brilliant job of, I should say quasi-Freudian, of explaining it without any hocus pocus. I mean, he does it
Hmm.
in very clear, precise, easy to understand English, and very plausible English too. So I think,
What
I urge
book
people.
is good to check out of Howard
Uh,
Schwartz's?
what's it called? It's actually I quote an article more than a book, but he
Okay.
did write a book also.
I can
Gee,
look
I don't
that
know.
up later
Yeah,
on.
look it up. It's in the final
Sure.
chapter of my
Okay.
my book. But yeah, Howard Schwartz is very good, and I think he talks about the psychological effects of the disrupted family. The disrupted family is not just a product of sexual radicalism. I think in many ways it's also a cause of sexual radicalism. Fatherless children
Mm. Mm.
are oftentimes become radical children.
Yeah. Why?
So it feeds upon itself.
Yeah.
Why?
Yeah.
That's a good question.
What's the use of the father? What means the man?
Well, that's a very good question, and you'll have to look at my book, but just briefly.
Okay. Yeah.
And I've looked at this over the years. I've had various ideas about it, and Schwartz helps a lot. Um, what does the father do? I think, from the standpoint of the left, I say this in one of my earlier books. Having grown up on the left, I was raised in a liberal left household, and I think one of the things that a father does, which I think the left should value, is it teaches us to rebel constructively. In other words, the first person as we grow up and enter adolescence and become rebellious, as many of us do, who's the first person we rebel against? We rebel against our father. He's the one, he suffers the brunt of it. And what does he do? If he's there, if he's a good father and he's there, what does he do? He teaches us how to rebel constructively. He teaches us I say that rebelling against someone we love is a good preparation, good training for learning to love those against whom we rebel. In other words, rebelling against your father, whom you love, is a good training for learning to love those against whom you rebel.
And why is that important, if not to save us from eternal revolt and resentment?
Exactly, to save us from nihilism, from existential revolt, which has open-ended and is just terroristic. And I think that's the problem with children that don't have fathers. They don't have anyone to revolt. They don't revolt against the father, who then channels their revolt. I know my father did this, if I could just invoke a autobiographical. My father, I rebelled against him. He was himself a liberal, but I went further and became a socialist and rebelled against him. And what did he do? He taught me how to rebel constructively and moderately and constructively and so forth. So, I think that's what fathers, even if they're imperfect fathers, even the, most, minimal father does it. But if there's no father at all, then who do you rebel against? You rebel against the world. You rebel against everything. You just have an existential revolt against the world. You revolt against your mother, probably first of all, the single mother. You revolt against your society, your street, your neighbors. You join a gang because that's a surrogate family, and you just revolt against society. And I think that's my nutshell. That's my thumbnail explanation for why fathers are important and why childless, fatherless children are at least prone or susceptible to, to extreme forms of a mindless, directionless rebellion for its own sake.
Okay. Well, that said, or that in mind, what is so scary about women?
Well,
Women in power. Well,
yeah,
when you
women in
brought up
power.
the conservatives being scared to death of women, is it not women in power? Is it not women's authority in a certain way that they're? And what
I
do you
think
mean
it
scared?
is. I think it is. I think it's also just the disapproval of women.
Huh.
I mean, men do things for the approval of women. They, arguably they provide home. They work at jobs they hate in order to provide homes and protection and prosperity for women.
Hmm.
And in return for that, they expect the woman to bear them children that will be recognized to be their children and no one else's. And what we have today is a society where men are expected to labor and sacrifice for women who either don't, well, who bear children that they then take away from those men. That's what the whole child support system is about. You're supposed to keep laboring for a woman who's taken your children away and won't let you be a
Ouch.
father. And
Hmm.
it's hardly surprising that the men revolt against this. The men refuse
Yeah.
and boycott this.
What ground do they have to stand on?
Very
If
little.
this
Well,
is
I
a
mean,
problem, if this is a problem, if the sexual radicalism is a problem, where does one find footing to resist it or to reform it or to challenge it?
um, well, I believe
Lovingly revolt.
right. I believe you have to again go back to a system of uh, marriage as a legally ob- enforceable contract with
Mhm.
a presumption of paternal rights. In other words, and even a presumption of father custody, which is really the same thing. I mean, that sounds a little. Um, uh, I mean, basically, we're the father. Where paternal rights are sacred for a father who plays by the rules.
Hmm. Yeah.
So if and I follow another book which I follow, and this is a man I regard as the greatest mind of the fathers and men's movement is Daniel Amneas. Daniel Amneas wrote a book called The Case for Father Custody. He was a brilliant writer. He was a Shakespeare scholar,
Hmm.
and he argued that the most important plank in the feminist platform was the mother custody of children in the welfare system and in the divorce system. And they
Hmm.
won they won this early on without firing a shot, with hardly a debate about it. And Amneas argued, and I think he was right. The more I've studied this over the years, the more I've arrived at the conclusion that Amneas was correct. That if you want to bring down the entire feminist edifice, at one go, you will bring down most of it if you take away the presumption of mother custody. Make sure that the children are in the custody of the father.
Why
If
would
there's,
fathers be better at anything, like just as a class, than mothers,
why would they be
especially with
better?
regard, yeah, for
Because
children, for society?
because there wouldn't be any divorces. That's why the the fathers, the mothers divorce because the mothers file all the divorces. And by the way, it's probably close to 100% when children are involved. Informally speaking, the statistics will tell you that women file 70% of divorces, but lawyers will tell you that when children are involved, the mother is filing the divorce virtually 100% of the time. So the mothers file divorce because they know they'll get the children and they can kick the father out of the family. That's basically what it is, to get rid of the father. You make sure the fathers have the custody and the divorces will disappear.
Hmm.
Um, so it's not a matter of fathers don't want to raise children, particularly the single fathers. Okay, they're not gonna kick the wives out of their families so they can raise the children by themselves. Men have no interest in doing that. They want a wife to raise their children with them together, that they will provide for and protect and sacrifice for. And so you make sure the fathers have custody of the children, and the divorces will, I guarantee you, they will disappear.
Well, is there a significant cultural scaffolding to support a male and a female, a young mother and father, a young husband and wife, to survive and strengthen their bond of marriage in this climate? I mean, is there not you're proposing a legal solution to what ultimately is a failure of human beings to get along, to love each other, and without like a scaffolding. Some might say religious, some might say cultural, whatever, but there's more than just the legal framework that needs to be there for husbands and wives to be husbands and wives. And with, there's plenty of stuff going on with the internet, pornography, dating apps, the cheapification of the sexual bond, like the utter degradation of sex as anything other than a biological, getting your rocks off transaction. It all precedes, or it's all a part of this whole thing of which divorce and then that legal structure and then welfare and all that other stuff is kind of supporting and feeding off of and feeding on.
Right. Very true. Very true. Well, yes. But at a minimum, you need that legal structure. Now,
okay.
I argue that, first of all, you need the legal structure. Without it, all the cultural talk is just an evasion. It's a way of avoiding dealing with the legal matter, because the legal matter is sine qua non. I mean, it has to be there. It's the Constitution says so, and everything says so. So it has to be there. But I also believe that by making that the goal, making that the single focus of, making that the single, I believe that will create a coherence in men, especially, and in women of goodwill who support them. And it will provide the coherent structure around which the culture and the other aspects of it, which are, you're right, they're absolutely necessary, but they will rebuild themselves. And they will have to, if there's no choice, and there won't be a choice if the legal structure is there, they will have to rebuild. Let me just give you an example. You mentioned the religious, which some people think is the origins of the culture begins with cult, begins with religion. And the religion is the foundation of culture. I happen to believe that myself. But one of the problems with all of this, one of the great causes of all of this, is the abdication of the churches. The churches originally were the ones that handled marriage. They consecrated it. They treated it as a sacrament.
Yep.
They were the line of first resort if a marriage or family life was in trouble. They were the counselors. They were the ones who would go and knock the heads together. They would put peer pressure on the couple, because the church wasn't just the pastor or the priest. It was also the congregation, the larger, and that was also the local population, the local community. So all of that, the church, Christian believers, the local community, the congregation, the pastor as an intellectual, all of that was part of the cultural pressure that would be put on the misbehaving spouse or spouses and forcing them to behave. And it is by abdicating that responsibility that the churches left a vacuum into which the legal practitioners stepped. In other words, forensic psychotherapists, for example, court-appointed psychotherapists. Where do they come from? They came from the fact that the churches no longer are the first line of counseling. It's now professional court-appointed psychotherapists. So the churches, and the pastors, especially priests, abdicated that role, and the judges and lawyers stepped in and filled it. In other words, the state. So you had a regime, a governing regime that was non-governmental, non-political in that sense, purely cultural, purely, moral pressure exerted by a non-coercive religious community. But, and I will also add this, the other thing the churches don't do, and they would have to do if for my scheme to work, imagine that a couple married in church, okay? They marry in a church, and they would have to, I think churches would, for reasons I'll get to, couples would learn that they need to marry in churches. They would see a reason to marry in churches, because if you marry in a church, and that marriage and those vows, that promises, and that covenant is witnessed as sacred by the priest, by the congregation, by the local community, by God, okay? And the state comes along and takes that sacred covenant and tears it up. Okay. I think that priest or pastor is going to look pretty foolish if he doesn't go into that courtroom and say, you can't do this. I consecrated this marriage. I speak for this sacred covenant, which, by the way, is also a legal contract under the Constitution, which you as a judge are bound to respect and enforce. Okay. I speak for God. I speak for the Constitution. I speak for the marriage as an institution. I speak for the wronged spouse, assuming it's only one spouse that's doing this. I speak for the children, and you are treading on God's turf. You have no right to, you, the judge, have no right to do this. You tape up that contract again and start enforcing it, or I'm going to raise a revolt in the local community and we're going to get rid of you. That's a perfectly legitimate role for a pastor or a priest to perform. It's the defining moments in Western history have come when churchmen, brave churchmen, have stood up and said to the civil authorities, you are encroaching on God's turf. You have no right to do that. And that's what the priests and the pastors should be doing in this case. They should be going into the courtrooms and not just providing a pretty ceremony with a bunch of flowers and hymns and things. No, it's a sacred bond. And if the state tears it up, then they have a right, a duty, an obligation to go into the courtroom and speak on behalf of the wronged parties. And that is not an entanglement of church and state. That is a perfectly legitimate role for a religious authority to do even in a secular commonwealth. It's what the churchmen over the ages have done. It's what what was his name, Ambrose of Milan, and John Fisher and Thomas More, and Richard Wurmbrandt under communism, and Cardinal Mindszenty in Hungary under communism, and over the ages, the kings, the czars, have abused their authority by trampling on God's turf. And the priests have stood up and said, you can't do this. And that's what they should all be doing on a smaller scale.
Well, yeah, another problem with modernity is that without something like a religion that is, or a collective ideology even, maybe it could take the place of this, what I'm saying, but without a counter powerful social belief structure and will, the state is undefeatable. And the state can make all these promises and enshrine rebellion in more and more people, because that rebellion, that sexual revolution, all these different various revolutions, they weaken the bonds of people, and they disincentivize men to stand their ground. They disincentivize, they incentivizes not just resentment, but reliance on the state. And so I can see that the case that you're making is going to terrorize the imaginations of those who want to live in freedom beyond bondage, where they see these contracts as bondage and they want the state to intercede on their behalf, not understanding that the state is the one that they're now bonded to.
Very true.
Right? So I'm just wondering, how do you make the case on a societal level to say that this is a better way to structure society than this free-for-all that we are in now?
Right. Well, I mean, for one thing, I think that if churches followed the prescription which I just laid out a minute ago, I think they would find their pews filling back up again. I think part of the problem, I don't think people have necessarily deserted Christian faith. They've deserted the churches because the churches are a bunch of wimps. I think people would see that Christian faith has a reason for existing, and the churches. I believe this in the book. I say this quite strongly, that churches at one time were vital for exactly this reason, vital civic institutions, and there's no substitute. I argue that in America, churches were kind of the first pressure groups. Yeah. But religious sects in early colonial America were the beginning of pressure group pluralism. But modern pressure groups run by lawyers don't offer the same
NGOs.
NGOs,
which
exactly,
just reinforce what the state wants, which is more encroachment.
which are oftentimes funded by the state. Yeah,
Yep.
exactly. They're not really NGOs at all because they're state funded NGOs.
Yeah.
And I think the churches, and religious believers, with or without the clergy, could see that their own self-interest,
Mhm.
as believers and churches as civic institutions, their self-interest is to come to is to do this, to take a stand on this particular issue, probably more than any others. I mean, how many people only go to church when they get married and when their children are baptized? I mean,
Hmm.
these are the milestones of life, and if the church doesn't mean anything in those instances, if it doesn't do anything when
Hmm.
there's a crisis, then it's hardly surprising that people desert the churches and even desert
Yeah.
the faith.
Yeah.
But so I think we could. I don't think it's impossible we could rebuild the churches. In fact, I think it's. I don't see an alternative. Frankly, I don't think secular ideologies have the same institutions uh, as churches do. They tend to build legal institutions composed of legal practitioners. Maybe I wouldn't say no, but
Hmm.
I've never
Yeah.
seen it.
Well, and man doesn't live by politics alone.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So, Dr. Baskerville, fascinating mind. Thank you very much for letting me pop some questions off and interact with you.
Well,
I had
thank
a
you.
really fun evening. Oh, morning for me, evening for you. Where can people find your books, and where else can they connect with you? Courses, lecture series, anything like that?
Probably the best place to start is my website, where they can find my books, and they can also find a link to my Substack, where I've written quite a lot since the book was published. But the website is stephenbaskerville.com, Stephen with a PH,
Mhm.
stephenbaskerville.com, and they'll find links to Amazon and my books and my Substack, where which has recent writings, and that's probably the best place.
Oh, excellent. Excellent. Thank you very much for your time.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the questions.